All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday night New York Giants Preservation Society meeting. Before we get started, I have a lot of things to discuss with you. For you really old timers, I guess you call it giant jottings tonight.
Sam Arrow.
I'm sorry?
Sam Arrow did Giant Johnny's.
There you go.
Stewart leads.
Before we get started, we lost a really good guy, one of our members, Tom Danes. Paul, you want to say a quick word about him?
Absolutely. Tom was a retired social studies teacher from the Monroe Woodbury School District. When he was retired, he taught a course on baseball and American society and taught U.S. history at Mount St. Mary College. Tom was a huge New York Giants fan who really never got over the fact that the New York Giants left and went to San Francisco. But Tom and I were real close. We played golf together, went to baseball games together. He was such a fan of the game and loved Willie, like we all do, just terrific. And I've lost one of my very best friends, and I'm really going to miss him. It was because of Tom that I ended up joining the group, because I didn't know about the group, and I'm forever grateful for his memory. I'm going to miss him. So
yeah, Tom was not necessarily a San Francisco fan, but he always wanted me to get us together to go to Citi Field. And the last time we went as a group, he was there. So why don't we all just take a moment of silence on behalf of Tom? Thank you. If anybody's interested in making a donation to, I think he's doing some kind of a food pantry, his family.
right, there's if you look up Food Bank of the Hudson Valley in lieu of flowers,
Yeah,
if anybody's willing to make a donation.
Yeah,
right.
And I will get it to the right people.
Okay.
Coming up next week, we have Joe Conte, who did a whole book on the rivalry between the New York Giants, Brooklyn Dodgers, San Francisco Giants, Los Angeles Dodgers. Storm and Norm Coleman is going to follow on the 24th about his collection of every person who's played with the Giants since they moved to San Francisco up until the present. Then in March, Jim Kaplan, who wrote The Greatest Game Ever Pitched, Juan Marichal, Warren Spahn. Scott Petoniak follows that with he did a memoir of Johnny Antonelli.
So far,
April 7th, we got Bill Lamb,
I'll
who
let
did
you
the
know.
whole history of the Giants franchise from their inception till when they left in New York. Couple of other things. I've been in contact with Peter Karasotis, who wrote the biography on Felipe Alou. He had some familial issues, but he's on board to come and speak. So that'll be a great thing. Alou never played with the New York Giants, but he was drafted by the New York Giants. What else? Ken Davidoff, who's our last speaker. I got an email from him, and it went into my spam, and it wasn't his usual email. And so I thought he was hacked, because the email said, after 25 years, I'm leaving, writing about baseball for the newspapers. And he retired, or he's going to retire from the Post. I don't know what his future plans are, but that'll be effective February 28th. And great guy, wish him the best. What else could I tell you? One of our other members, Steve Treader, who wrote the Stonen biography, was given an award by Saber as the best new factual documentary biography, whatever it is you want to call it. I also joined Saber about a week ago, which will give me the ability to track down more people to speak to our group. And lastly, tonight's guest, we went to school together in SUNY Albany, did not know each other, just missed each other. And we got another great painter down there. I don't know, somebody's on their laptop, KRM's on their laptop. Anyway, I want to apologize to him first, not for not knowing him at SUNY, but I sent it out yesterday with a misspelling of his last name. So Dan, my apologies to you. And so tonight we have Dan Vandemortel, who will be speaking about a very famous shooting that happened in the Polo grounds. Dan, welcome. You're a group member anyway, but welcome and thank you so much for speaking tonight. Floor is yours.
All right. Thanks a lot, Gary. And I know I speak on behalf of the group for saying thanks for all the good work you do with this. I'm sure there's a lot of work that we don't see, and you do an amazing job getting speakers from all over the country without too many gaps. So I don't know how you do it, but keep on doing it. Like I told you yesterday, you cannot die. You have no permission to die. You have to keep doing this for at least another 200 years. Sorry. I'm going to try to share the screen. Let's hope that that goes well.
Come on, Dan, you can do it. There we go. You did it.
All right. Does everyone see it?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So what I'm going to do is just go through a slideshow presentation, and I'll be talking, but I'll have a lot of pictures. There's probably like 25, 26 pictures. I would ask you, if you've not already done so, to please mute yourself, and plenty of time for questions and answers and drilling and interrogation after this is all done. Happy to try to answer anything you have. Before I go, I'd like to, since we have this book up, I'd like to give a shout out to Stu Thornley, who was on. Can you please mute yourself? Thanks. I'd like to give a shout out to Stu Thornley, who is, I think, also on this call. An amazing editor, put this great book together about the Giants. If you haven't already picked up this book, please do so. It's a great collection of articles, and I'm not just saying that because my article is in there.
And for
So
those of you who don't know, we had Stu as a guest about the book. It's fabulous, informative. Welcome back, Stu. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, let's start the story off with Bernard Doyle. Here we have a picture of Mr. Doyle right here, up here. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but he's up in the top row, over to the right, second to the right, standing up. This is a picture taken about 1915. He was born in 1896 in Lowell, Massachusetts, made his way to the greater New York City area, and left school around the 8th grade, like many people did back then. And probably his first real exposure to getting to the outside world is he served in World War I. He was drafted and put in the Navy, and he was over in England for a time. And by the time he came back, now we're probably to like roughly around 1920. Here we have a picture of him with his lovely bride, Mary Margaret Corliss. And they situated in Union City, New Jersey, and kind of just began to raise a family, one son, one daughter. And eventually, at some time in the 1910s or 1920s, he became very interested in boxing. I don't know if he boxed in the ring, but I think that's quite likely, because I don't know how you get interested in it just to be a trainer or a coach. So he probably did box in some way. But by the 1920s, he got into being a trainer for boxers, and he became a head trainer at a New Jersey athletic club. And during this time, there was a boxer by the name of Joe Braddock that he took under his wing. And Joe Braddock became, moved right up the ranks. He became the state welterweight championship in 1923, definitely on his way to the big time. And then right around this same time, Joe's younger brother, James, front or bottom row over to the right, he also entered Doyle's orbit. And this guy was, James was really on the rise, a terrific boxer, won the amateur title in two weight divisions. So around 1925, Bernard Doyle is really basically looking at being the king of a potential boxing dynasty. And he was quite the character in the boxing world. He was kind of known as Barney Doyle in boxing. And he was known as a very verbose promoter. You ask him a question, Hour or two later, he might be done talking about how great his fighter was and how he was the best he ever lived and all that. So anyway, he was really presiding over a really great thing until he had an altercation during one of Joe Braddock's boxing matches. I won't go into it here, it'll take up too much time, but there was a severe rift that happened at that fight, and the wounds from that were never severed. Both boxers left Doyle's orbit, and Doyle went on to still be a boxing trainer and coach, but not for anyone really significant. Meanwhile, the Braddocks, Joe kind of kept boxing, but James hit the stars. He became the heavyweight championship, and he became the heavyweight champion in 1935 through 1937. And if any of you have ever seen the movie Cinderella Man, which won several Academy Awards, that's about that James Braddock. So it was an interesting situation where in just one instant, in one fight, at one sporting event, Bernard Doyle's life changed drastically, going one way, now going the other way. So we move forward to the 1940s, and by this time, Bernard Doyle was kind of done with the boxing, more or less, interested in it, but not doing the managing and the training so much, at least not at the formal level where he's really trying to get a boxer all the way moving up. So he settles in various New Jersey locations, leads pretty basic, normal life. He's working for he's a railway express freight sorter on the New Jersey docks, so kind of a blue collar job, which is what he had throughout most of his life. But the other love that he had over all these years was baseball. He was a big Giants fan, liked to go to the Polo grounds whenever he had the time. And in 1950, he was going to go with his son to a game, but his son couldn't go for whatever reason. So he decided to go with a former neighbor and former boxing associate. His name was Otto Flagg. So he decided to take Otto Flagg's son, also known as Otto, decided to take him to the game. Otto at this time was 14 years old. And you know, we all know like what it's like to be 14 years old and you're going to go to a baseball game. He was off the charts with excitement. So Doyle and Flagg got tickets to go to the July 4th game, doubleheader on a Tuesday, Giants and Dodgers on America's birthday. It really doesn't get any better than that. So they, on the morning of the 4th, they both went to the ballpark, took public transportation. I don't know exactly how they got there, but they didn't drive, so it was public transportation. And when they got to the park, they went to, I don't know if you can see the little balloon here up here in the top right-hand corner, but they sat in section 42, row C, an unreserved seating area. So they moseyed into the seats, and just as they got to the seats, they decided to switch seats because Flagg, being 14 years old, couldn't see because of fan obstruction. So they switched seats. Doyle sat in seat 3, and then Flagg sat in seat 4 to his right. And around 12:30, the still arriving crowd, the crowd got to be over 49,000. It was a packed house. So it's 12:30, and the Dodgers are taking the field for infield warm-ups and batting practice. So they're watching it. And here's another picture that kind of shows from a different angle where they were sitting. So you can kind of see if you were a bird flying along that level, like looking towards section 42. Here's where they are. And here's the view from where Doyle and Flagg were sitting. The circle area is where they were sitting. If you look off to the distance, you'll see the diamond. And up above, you'll see Coogan's Bluff. And up above that, you'll see a row of apartment buildings. That is along a place called Edgecombe Avenue, which is part of sort of Harlem, but kind of Washington Heights. It's also known as the Sugar Hill area. It's kind of like in one of those areas where it's like a little bit in between, but for just going forward, I'm just going to call it Harlem Sugar Hill. I'm not going to call it Washington Heights. So around 12:30, they're watching the game, and Doyle turns to Flagg to say something. We're going to pause it there. So we're going to move on to going to the other side of that ballpark, looking at Harlem. Harlem in 1900 was 80% white, or I'm sorry, 90% white. It wasn't even extremely filled up yet, but it was 90% white. Over the ensuing years, Harlem changed just dramatically. The Harlem Renaissance took place in the 20s and 30s, which was a big artistic, cultural, and political expression where blacks were famous to this day. Thurgood Marshall, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, Paul Robeson, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., just a roll call of historic black figures, came to reside in that area. And the music scene was jumping, the literary scene was jumping. So a lot of blacks from the South and other parts of the country moved up to northern industrial centers, took over not only in volume, but also in just the leverage they had over the community. And the neighborhood just changed completely. When the Depression hit, that changed a lot of things. It just clobbered all of America, but it clobbered Harlem pretty badly. Because the migration of blacks kept coming. But by this time, the economy is not doing well. Harlem's getting overcrowded. There's not enough space. You have poor, sometimes uneducated, sometimes illiterate people moving to a city where there aren't a lot of jobs. It's already overcrowded. So the neighborhood, not all of the neighborhood, so when I say Harlem begins to deteriorate, I don't mean every single block, every single street, because that's not accurate. But as a whole, it is going through tremendous demographic changes. And the economy began to go down in the 40s, probably like around the 30s and 40s. Crime is beginning to escalate. Again, in certain parts of the neighborhood, not as covering the whole neighborhood. So the Harlem that Doyle would have known back in the day is not the Harlem that we're looking at in 1950. Some people are still doing well. Kids are going to school. There's good families. There's families that are getting by. Then there's families mired in poverty and crime. It's just, but the overall tenor is more problematic than it was, certainly than it was in like the 1910s, 1920s. So by 1950, a number of the prominent people I just mentioned were no longer in residence there or had moved maybe to some other part of New York City. But someone who was living there was this person, Marie Beld, very average person, domestic worker, grew up in North Carolina, moved to New York, married in roughly 1917, lived, her husband was gone a few years after that, lived in various places in Harlem, usually with a number of family, a number of what we call lodgers, which are people that don't have a permanent residence. So they move in with other people because maybe they're underemployed or unemployed. Everyone's just trying to get by, and you bring on people to try to pay the rent. That's kind of how it went. So another person who was with her, starting around 1936, 37, was her great nephew, Robert Mario Peebles. Peebles was 19 months old when he came to live with her. He was born in New York. I don't know exactly where, but he was born in New York. And his parents had split already. So at 19 months old, his parents are split, and he's living with his great aunt, who was a person of very modest means, but she worked her butt off to help Robert adjust. She worked long hours, put in extra hours, worked overtime, did whatever she could do to get him in nursery school from ages 2 to 8, where he did very well. But then something happened to her. I don't know what happened to her, but she got ill. She then no longer had the ability to work. Someone can shut their phone off, please. Thanks. So by that time, she was having a lot of problems. And so she could not afford to put him in nursery school. So she had to put him in more of a public school situation. And from there, he didn't really fare so well. He began to have a lot of mental issues, sleepwalking issues. It's a very unsettled background. He has no parents. He's living with her. She's moving all over the time. They don't have much money, living with a rotating cast of family and lodgers. You can probably imagine the unsettling effect that would have on a very young person. It'd be bad enough for someone our age, but for someone in their early years, very tough. So as people is growing up, we begin to see two kinds of Peebles. Just to show, this is the building that they lived in. This is 515 Edgecombe Avenue. So we begin to see that Peebles goes to this comes, he went to this place called the Lafarge Clinic, which is at the St. Philip's Church on West 134th Street. And he was seeing care there. It's not an institution, it's an out care facility, but he was going there. So there's obviously a lot of mental issues going on, a lot of child raising issues. It's a very unsettling situation. So by 1950, we kind of have two Robert Peebles. Here's the Peebles that looks like kind of like a nerdy high school student. He reads comic books. He has some after school jobs where he delivers groceries. He's doing okay at school. He's moving along in school. He's not being held back. He's not flunking out, but he looks kind of like a normal kid when you look at this picture. Then we have the other Robert Peebles. This now you notice that the placid look is not there. He's smoking cigarettes and he's beginning to develop a really not pleasant rap sheet in Harlem. Not serious stuff, not killing somebody, not driving and killing somebody, but just burglary, that kind of stuff, theft. One thing he had was an arrest for grand larceny involving an automobile theft in 1950. Most of the charges either went away or the automobile theft he was found guilty of a reduced charge of juvenile delinquency because he's only 14 at the time. So now we're going to flip forward back to Flagg and Doyle at the game. So by the time Doyle turns around to Flagg and begins to say something, they hear a loud popping noise. And Flagg sees Doyle slump over. Blood starts coming out of his ears, his nose, and he's freaked out. So he calls for attendance. And here's a picture of not too long after the shooting of what people were looking at. Now, a lot of people, including Flagg, thought that Doyle just had a heart attack or a stroke, or they just didn't know what happened. All these people around them, all the police, initially, that's what they're thinking happened. There's no alarm because, it's not like someone walked up the aisle and just shot Mr. Doyle dead. Everyone's confused, just very, very kind of hard to fathom situation. So eventually people are brought to the medical and police professionals and medical professionals are brought here. They take Doyle away and they do pronounce him dead. It turns out that they do find that there is a bullet hole and a bullet entry hole observed. So they do begin to figure out that, okay, at least he died, but then they're still mystified. Well, how did he die? There was no one at the stadium who shot him. So just kind of a very unsettling situation. The game continued on. It wasn't canceled. People in this section where they occupied the seats, but it wasn't really, people that I talked with who were there, like no one really just had a handle on what's going on. So there was really no reason to panic. And I like what one person I interviewed said. He said, it's not in the New York mind to panic. We can put up with anything. So I think that kind of sums it up. So Flagg was taken to the police station, and here we see him at the police station. He was as baffled as anyone else. He didn't really have much information to pass along. And that's kind of where it's at. So now you're left to, and I found this really interesting, not being a police officer, not ever having really participated in any kind of investigation like that. But how do you find out who shot someone in a situation like that, where there are no eyewitnesses, no evidence, no clue who did it? And as far as I could tell, no one had a grudge against Mr. Doyle to shoot him near or from afar. So they conducted and this was big news when it happened in New York City. As you can imagine, it would be huge news now and with all the social media. But even back then, it was just an enormous story. It was covered in every New York City newspaper for days. It was covered practically in most papers across the country, at least by the AP and UPI wires. So the police fanned out. They combed the park. They combed outside the park. They conducted an exhaustive search of every nook and cranny they could find. And Tuesday evening, so we're talking about 9 hours after the shooting, they arrest a bunch of boys, and one of them is Peebles. And they find that he has some .22 weapons at his place. And up on the rooftop, there are shells from target practice. So they let the other boys go. They arrest Peebles, and they think they've sort of got their man. I mean, they feel like, well, that's plenty of 22 shells around, matches shells that they found other places on the bluff. That's their best suspect. The following morning, they get a rude awakening because the examination of Doyle shows it's a 45 that killed him, not a 22. So now they've kind of moved along, but they're kind of stuck with somebody they're arrested for one thing, but they don't have the evidence for something else. So they keep combing the park that Wednesday, that Thursday. They keep interviewing Peebles, and he says he didn't do it. That he was out playing when it happened. He didn't shoot anything. He didn't fire a shot that killed anybody. He didn't fire any shot at all. So it's kind of stonewalling, and there's a lot of speculation in the press about what's going on, but basically not too much progress is made until the Friday when Peebles suddenly and unexpectedly confesses. So from here, we get the police version of what happened to Peebles. Peebles doesn't speak. There's really no investigative journalism at this time. It's basically the police tell the press what they're doing. The press reports it. That's it. Completely unlike what would happen today, where there would just be real journalists and would-be journalists who would do all sorts of speculation, digging, whatnot. There's really none of that going on. So Peebles confesses and says he had the .45 pistol, one bullet in the chamber. He found it in Central Park 6 months before. Went up to the roof that day at 12:30, fired at a 45 degree angle out of 4th of July exuberance. Came back down, took the gun to the basement, flushed the shell down the toilet, had no intention of firing the shot in the Polo grounds, didn't even know he did that, but he fired the shot. On the roof, per the police, he would have been unable to see the Polo grounds anyway. So he just fired the shot, and that's how it worked. Half hour after the shooting, he heard that the bullet had struck someone in the park. He freaked out, got very frightened, went down to the basement, grabbed the gun, took it from his hiding place, took it to High Bridge Park, and here is where he took it. So if you take the southeastern portion of this, he said he took it to High Bridge Park, off the edge of the swimming pool, from a bluff, threw it down into a ravine kind of along the Harlem River driveway, threw the gun there, and then came back home. He also admitted at the time that sometime that day that he stole money from a nearby house. So after he signed the confession, the police took him to the park. Here we have a picture of him taking him to the park. And he got to the point where he pointed up towards the bluff where he threw the gun, or he said he threw the gun. He went up, he recreated it with the police, grabbed a rock, threw something, throw it over the edge. There you go. And everyone watched. And then they went down to the area to wherever the rock would have landed and start looking for the gun. And here he is with another police officer back down at the area roughly where it landed. And he's pointing at the area where he thought that it kind of went through the, there were a lot of trees or brushes, there were shrubs, but this is roughly where he thought it might have landed. And that's where he kind of fades out for a little bit. The police looked a lot right then and there. They looked that day, they looked the next day. I mean, they brought out the Marines, they had minesweepers, they had drug sniffing dogs, they had, gun sniffing, anything they can find a dog that'll sniff. They had tons of detectives who showed up, volunteers who helped, and they could never find the gun. Meanwhile, Peebles spent that week and a few weeks waiting up for his court hearing at the youth house, which is no longer a youth house, but the building is still there on 331 East 12th Street on the Lower East Side. And that's a place where juveniles were sent either for evaluation or awaiting a court date or while they're awaiting an interrogation. So I'd like to turn, actually, just before I do that. So a few weeks later, Peebles had a hearing in children's court, and he was found guilty of ownership of the .322 weapons and ammunition. The charge for possession of the .45 and discharging it were dismissed because there was no evidence. And that's kind of where the case resided until he was sentenced to the Warwick Training School for Boys, which is a place, I'll get to that later, but it's kind of like a reform school. The only thing of note that happened between him going and showing people at Highbridge Park what was going on, and that was there was an arrest of 3 people on July 15th. 3 people were arrested for supplying Peebles with the 22, at least one of the 22s. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know the disposition of their case, but to me, it seems like there's something there with them. And I don't know what other angle was there and what knowledge they would have of the 45, but there is something that's kind of lurking there. So I'd like to turn to right now, and I could spend probably the whole presentation doing this. I don't want to do that, but there are a number of flaws, or at least doesn't make any sense moments with this case. I've kind of told you what the police said about this, and that's what's been transcribed ad nauseum from police reports. If you go on the internet now, I'd say at least 90% of those will just spill back what I just told you. There's really not a whole lot of probing or critical thinking about it. So you have to look at people's case through the 1950s, a very segregated time. Baseball itself was segregated, as we were talking about the book earlier, where it took years for all these teams to get their first black player. It didn't happen until 1959. So there's a cover from a 1950 Saturday Evening Post that just shows this is how America envisions baseball. This is how it sees itself. Notice there are no black fans here, even though at an average Giants game at that time, there would have been a number of black players because Harlem's right next door. They went. If they can afford to go, they go. So the coverage was kind of had 2 tracks. The white coverage press, just basically almost non-existent. The police tell them what it is, they write it down, that's it. No investigative journalism. This is years before Norman Mailer, Gay Talese, Joan Didion, Thomas Wolfe, Hunter Thompson. The investigative journalism doesn't really work that way then. You know, it's not until the 60s or 70s where there was much more of a let's look at things, let's use our own style and our own investigative techniques. Not so much a happening thing in 1950. The only person really who really did the dirty work was a reporter from the Washington Afro-American called James Hicks. His name was James Hicks. And he went to the top of the roof, which you'll see here. And he talked to the superintendent, went to the top of the roof, and just kind of looked at things. And he came away with like a lot of things just don't really add up here. As you'll see from this picture, this is what the reporter would have seen when he looked out. So this whole idea that Peebles wouldn't know where he's shooting really doesn't carry any weight, because you see the slits there, which he could have looked through. Plus, that is the only side of the building that has those slits. So anyone who is going up to that roof would know that's where the Polo Grounds is. You can't really confuse it. So it kind of seems problematic that how the police can say, well, he wouldn't have known, he couldn't possibly have known he was shooting in that direction, when it's pretty obvious that anyone would have known that they were shooting in that direction. And Hicks also called into question that a lot of people questioned the veracity of the confession, and also that a lot of people wondered how could a bullet from that distance travel all that way and have enough energy and force to kill Mr. Doyle. So he asked all these questions, which were actually really good questions to ask, and still are good questions to ask. And unfortunately, his analysis was only shared by his limited Black readership, because the rest of America was pretty much, as I mentioned, treated to like the basic between the 40-yard line story, with this picture showing a white man at the front of the building, poising like he's got a 22 or a rifle, pointing directly to where Peebles is shooting, which is not even what the confession is even alleging. So you really see 2 different realities going on here. And it's very, it just creates a lot of two realities. There's 2 realities going on at the time in New York City. There's the reality in Harlem and non-Harlem. There's the reality in the coverage of the 2 things. And there still is somewhat today, because not too many people are going and looking to find James Hicks' article and like, oh, I think I'll source that when I do something on YouTube about the shooting. So I'll just bullet point here a number of odd things about that just don't really seem to line up. The 45 has always seemed problematic to me because allegedly Peoples picked it up in Central Park. And afterwards, I'd like a show of hands of any of you, since a lot of you live in New York City, have any of you ever walked through Central Park and just looked around like, oh my God, there's a gun. I think I'll just take that home. I mean, that really stretches plausibility. And then if you factor that in with that all the police went to this area where he said he ditched the gun and no one can find the gun. That also, I mean, you take those two things, you're really getting to statistical, like it's almost impossible for both of those things to happen. As I mentioned, the 3 people arrested for supplying a 22 to Peoples, don't know what happened to them, never interviewed, never tracked down. Peebles' attorney, never talked to, never questioned, never in an interview. Beld, never interviewed, never questioned. No retrospective, even after that, of anyone trying to track down people. I mean, basically no one is interviewed about this other than the police. And I'm not trying to slam the police. They had a very, very difficult job. And I'm not questioning their efforts, but I'm just saying that there is a limited flow of information here that's only coming from one source. It's hard to know too if, like, I keep wondering how Peebles did all that he was accused of doing on July 4th. 12:30, supposedly he fired a shot. He has time to go rob a nearby house. He takes the gun to Highbridge Park, goes there, has time to come back and do that. And then at 3 o'clock, he goes to Coney Island, and he's in Coney Island until 9 o'clock. That's a really full day, and I'm not sure how all of this really adds up. I mean, eventually you just run out of hours to accomplish all of this. I also can't fathom why anyone who shot into the Polo grounds and found out, either he knowingly shot there or found out, wow, I didn't mean that to happen. I don't fathom why that person, I can fathom why they would ditch a gun, but I can't fathom why they would burglarize a nearby house. I mean, I would think that anyone would think, I think I'm just, at least for the next few hours, I'm going to lay low. I'm not even going to jaywalk. I would be paranoid that the cops would be somewhere. And I really don't know how linear the dots are that connect Peebles to the shooting. When he had his hearing, one of his friends testified that after the police took him to the police armory, and showed him a bunch of guns, he saw a 45 there and said, yes, Peebles had a 45 gun, which may be true, but given all the other uncertainty about this, I don't know for a fact that that's what the deal is, because I can see some scenarios where I don't know if his friend was there on the roof with him, or maybe his friend dropped the dime on Peebles to get out of it somewhere else. Or the underlying theory I always have with this is that someone else was on the roof, either with Peebles or by themselves, someone who could have been tried for an adult crime. And I wouldn't be shocked if Peebles ended up taking the fall, because the worst he could get is a juvenile delinquency charge and be sent to reform school, where someone else, anyone over 15, 16 years old, would be nailed for an adult crime. You're looking at significant jail time. Huge difference. And lastly, the confession has always seemed a bit weird to me. Not that he made one, but the circumstances around it. At his hearing, it was determined that the police had given him some money, a small amount of money, and had interviewed him at times without any adult supervision or a solicitor. And Marie Beld also told a social worker that that basically the way it went too is that the police told Peebles, confess and we'll let your old aunt out of jail. And they even let him make a call after she was let out of jail to verify that. So it's kind of murky. And the part to me it kind of rings true that maybe his confession could be in some parts coerced is, if you take a look at this confession, I'll just let you read it for a second. So it strikes me from this is there is definitely an intellectual mismatch between Peebles, 14, and an experienced group of detectives, which there would be with any juvenile. But in my non-baseball life, I have worked on a lot of Northern Ireland political issues, and I've seen a number of confessions from Republican prisoners in Northern Ireland, Loyalist prisoners, and there's a certain kind of confession you see. You don't see where it's kind of this, and then, well, here's a PS. Well, then here's another PS. Basically, you confess to something, and there might be like one tiny little PS at the end, but that's kind of about it. So it seems to me like something like, well, things just kind of keep getting added on here and added on here. It seems strange to me, but make of it what you will. So whether he was guilty or innocent or whatnot, Peebles, as I mentioned earlier, went to the Reform School in Warwick. Actually a nice looking building, built to kind of resemble kind of like a New England elite private schools, at least from the outside. So he had a long orientation there. It's kind of like going into the Army. They give you an orientation. They conduct physical and mental tests to see where they should place them. They had a number of cottages, some for hardcore boys, some for not so bad. And so he did that, and then you're given a standard uniform. You get a haircut. Everyone looks roughly the same. And then he was placed there, and he did his time there for 2 years. It was a very kind of there were school facilities there and religious facilities, some athletics. It probably would have been a big adjustment for him because this place is really it's out there. It's about 50 miles north west of Harlem, way out in the country. You're more likely to hear a cow than a gunshot. And at night, you're probably more likely to hear an owl than a police car. And so I would imagine that probably the silence would be a bit unnerving, I would think, and maybe just the isolation. So anyway, he was there for a couple of years, and by most accounts, what little I was able to find out, he was a quiet boy, did his work. One person I talked with thought he was kind of quiet. She wasn't sure if he was quiet because he was just kind of shy, or is it more because he was a little bit sullen and withdrawn, as some of them were. You have all sorts of kids here, but mostly they're like 12 to 16 years old. A lot of black kids, but not all black. A lot not from New York City, and some are mild criminals. Some are kind of on the tough side. You have your soft cases and you have your hard cases. So anyway, he was there until 1952, and he got out. And at the time he got out, the recidivism rate for Warwick was 80%, meaning that there was an 80% chance that someone leaving that facility was going to get arrested for something, whether it's a low crime or a high crime. But it was a tough recidivism. I can't say that word, recidivism rate. So for Peebles went to Troy after that, somehow settled in Troy. And he ended up getting a job at the YMCA in 1957. And while there as a clerk, a couple of guys came in and forced him to empty the safe and the cash register, and then they tied him up. And here's a picture. I had no idea that Robert Peebles would be in Troy, New York. No inkling that why he should be. And so when I found this picture, I was immediately struck by, if you look at him pointing towards the safe there, he's showing basically where the crime took place and where they took the money. Amazing similarity to the other picture we went to earlier, where he was pointing to where a gun was disposed of at the High Bridge. So very strange for him to be on the receiving end of a crime. After that, his life kind of settled and became reasonably normal for a year or so. He had office, kind of like just like basic office jobs. He worked at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Gary, that'll ring a bell to you a little bit. For a very short period of time, just doing probably like very basic office work. It might have even been janitorial. I don't know. We're not talking anything fancy here. But the wheels came off the track somewhat in 1959. He was back down in Harlem at that time, and he got arrested at a Harlem hotel for on a Troy police warrant because in Troy, he was accused of breaking into a general merchandise store and stealing 4 weapons. He was taken into custody in Harlem at the hotel, where he did have some arms and ammunition. They took him back to Troy, and the charges against him for that were dropped due to insufficient evidence. But also at that time, the Troy Children's Court went after him because a warrant was issued for his arrest for non-support of his wife and children. By this time, he had had at least for a year, maybe two, he'd had a wife and child, or two children. And he'd been delinquent on his payments. So he was, they tracked him down. At this time, he seems like he's just kind of wandering about while his wife and two kids are living in a public housing project in Troy. I don't know what happened with that. The last trace I've had from him is 1962, where his wife put an ad in the Troy newspapers, a notice seeking his whereabouts because she was instituting divorce proceedings. And if any of you have ever been divorced or know someone who has, if a husband or a wife just went AWOL, in order to properly proceed with it, you have to put a notice somewhere where you can say, I made an attempt to find this person. If you find them, you bring them into the system. If you don't find them, then the system or the procedure can go ahead. So I don't know how that was disposed of. I really don't know. I'm guessing pretty darn sure that they were divorced. And after that, the trail on him goes cold. As Stu can attest, because we swapped many emails about it and probably a phone call or two. I did an exhaustive search to try to find this person. He's probably the most difficult person I've ever tried to find in my life. As I've kind of gotten back into this story in the last few months, I'm going to get a private detective in San Francisco to see if they can at least ascertain if he's alive or dead and see if I can find anything. My supposition is he's probably dead, but I don't know, and it'd be nice to find out a little bit more. So that's where you have it, a very bizarre case. And what's always struck me, just in concluding, that's just so tragic about this is on the morning of July 4th, Marie Beld, Robert Peebles, and Bernard Doyle did not wake up thinking that this was going to be a day anything like what it turned out to be. Bernard Doyle just went to a game with a young boy, and just a 1 in a million random shot died. Never knowing that he, by his moving seats with Otto Flag, that he switched places with Flag, and he probably saved a young boy's life. And I've never met Mr. Doyle, but I bet you if you asked him, would he make that trade? I bet you he would have. I bet you he would have. And for Peebles and Beld, so much uncertainty. The neighborhood's going down. Neither one of them were born at the start of the race line. That's why I guess I'd like to know more about Peebles. Like, where did he wind up? It seemed like his trail was going in a bad direction. I don't know if he ever kind of got it pulled back together or not. But it's a sad story on all sides. And one can only imagine if this happened today, the hullabaloo about it, probably the increased ballpark security. It probably would be, if that happened here at Oracle Park, I would imagine like within a few days or a week, probably getting in there would be like crossing the Israeli-Palestinian border. They would have so much security in there. So that's where we leave it. I turn it back over to Gary, and it'd be nice if Stu just said a few words about the book. And it was not an easy book for him to get published, I'll tell you that.
Well, it took a while, and I appreciated everybody's patience. One of the good things with it was that Dan continued to find new information as he does to this day, and we were going back and forth with that. And fortunately, the editors were open to it. Oftentimes with a book, this is it. That's they were kind of locked in, but they were open and understanding too that this was kind of an ongoing story. And we had a lot of, you mentioned Bill Lamb was going to be speaking. I hope I can attend that. Bill contributed some great stuff in the forms of biographies on the owners of the Giants and the landowners of the Polo grounds, and John Pasteur and Ron Selter, who have written, because there's a lot of books in this series, Comiskey Park and Forbes Field, and those guys do great work on all ballparks. But this was my favorite one in the bunch to read it. And then it was so much fun kind of staying in touch with Dan, because he'd come up with new stuff as he has here. And one thing, Dan, I don't recall what you tracked Otto Flag, the kid, the junior, for a while too. How did he end up?
Otto Flagg died at roughly age 55, 56. So he, as far as I know, he was probably a reasonably adjusted youngster, got out of high school, joined the Marines for a time. So he was in the Marines, and his dad wanted him to become, had always wanted him to become a firefighter. But he decided to become a cop. So he became a cop, and then he became a higher up in the, I don't know if, and correct me, as I'm sure you will, I may not be pronouncing this area right, the Teterboro Police. He became a higher up there, and he had the nightmare that none of us want to have. He retired, and shortly thereafter he died. I tracked down his son, Christopher Flagg. Took some doing, but tracked him down. And so he gave me some insight on his dad and whatnot. And he said his dad didn't really talk about it a whole lot, but when he did, he's kind of like his dad was kind of like one of those guys that not like an Alan Alda feelings kind of guy, but when he did say something, you sat down and you listened to him because it probably wasn't going to be repeated too often. And I tracked down some of the Doyle family too. Grandkids, and they were tremendously helpful. A few of the pictures you see here were courtesy of them. Unfortunately, it's a grandfather that they never got to meet, and they could give me some background on them, but their information kind of stopped in 1950. The rest of the family, persisted. His wife died, I think, in 1979-ish, give or take. And both of Bernard Doyle's children have passed away, but his grandchildren are around.
How about I don't know much about guns. I mean, and how far was it? 550 feet?
372 yards, I think. 70 feet or yards. I'm drawing a blank.
Okay, so 900 feet. How far would a bullet from a 45 go?
I kind of read, I've read various theories on that. I think I've read more that indicates that a shot could go that far and potentially strike someone and kill them than I have read that it's impossible. It's not a slam dunk. But I guess if we were in a court of law and you're trying to weigh the evidence and you've got 65% saying yes and 40% saying no, well, you'd probably adjudicate it that way, but it wouldn't be really conclusive.
That's if he actually were aiming the thing in there, as we saw in that picture with the slot. If he was up on the roof firing 4th of July celebration, I'm thinking of July 26, 1959 in Havana. Leo Cardenas got winged, Frank Verdi in the ballpark, and I don't know, people were they just fired their shots when it hit midnight. It was the 26th of July, and I've always wondered, what did that thing go up and over? Or, people's explanation was he was just firing, more in the air?
Yeah, they said, well, a 45-degree angle, firing obviously towards the ballpark, and it would have gone up and then come down. Although he's, per the police, what they said, well, he didn't know that he was shooting at the ballpark, but that doesn't hold water. If you getting back to like if it was a legal case now, if you were trying to prove the shot could go that far, I mean, you would have some forensics people in there. You'd also have to calculate not only just ballistics, but also the wind pattern that day to see if that's even feasible. I mean, some shot killed Doyle, and I guess I could see it coming from that roof. It's possible that Peebles did it. I'm not here saying that there's no God-given way that Robert Peebles fired that shot. It just doesn't seem to line up. I feel 100% confident that it does not line up with the way it's been reported on most of the within the 40-yard lines, shallow reporting that's been done on this. One thing that's interesting while I was doing this is that, I was kind of on an island with this. There weren't too many sources other than James Hicks to go to like get a whole lot of insight. But I was churning on it. I'd swap emails with Stu back and forth, and he read it and he's like, yeah, I think you got something here. I didn't know that independently that there was a University of Georgia professor, English professor, who also got interested in this, and it would take too long to explain how he got interested in this. But his angle is he got interested in Peebles because of his reading of comic books. Again, a very long story. But he started doing some digging and he actually found some things that we overlapped on. And then we found each other and we had this, I think we were on the phone for about 2 hours, but kind of like the holy smokes moment, like, wow, you've been doing this in Georgia. I've been doing this in San Francisco, never met each other. And we came to a lot of the same conclusions. So it actually made me feel very validated, like I'm not going cuckoo or, yeah, I'm not being one of those people on TV where they just question everything, but they don't give anyone any answers. I'd give anything to have been on that roof, a fly on the roof, a bug, anything. Don't know, but hopefully I can find out more and keep the chains moving. I do plan to keep following this and researching it. There's information that will come out later this year. And there's some really interesting information about Peebles that will come out in the year 2025. So my plan is to live long enough to be able to access it. And I can see another article, possibly a book on this. I'm not losing track of this.
All right.
Gary, Gary, over to you.
Dan, first of all, thank you so much for being so informative. It's great talk. When are you working on your JFK book?
I used to think that there was something there, but then I read Vincent Bugliosi's Reclaiming History book, and I don't wonder about that anymore.
And the other thing is, the whole expose could be found in Stu's book, correct, on the Polo Ground.
Hint, hint, hint. Correct, you are.
Okay. All right. We're gonna open it up now to questions. We're gonna go to Steve, then Paul, then Bill. Steve, go ahead.
Great presentation. You know,
Thank you.
maybe it's because we're, New York Giant fans. Some of us remember some of this stuff. There's so many eerie things. This is just one. What happened at Thompson's Ball? There's books written, movies, the telescope story, even that, there's some loose ends there as well. I just want to refer to the one picture, and I'm not being racist, obviously. The picture that you showed and it was the lower level with all the white people and one of the players catching the ball. Those seats were expensive. From my knowledge, in the early 50s, and I had a friend who was older than me, passed away, Gary knows, Dan Heidel. Dan Heidel he was a vendor in the Polo Grounds. Upper deck, left field is where a lot of the Harlemites used to sit. Not that lower deck was taboo, but it was cheaper, and that's where they sat. I think I sat there too. Upper deck, left field.
I don't want to. If you have a question, I don't want to interrupt. But actually, since you brought the topic up about that picture, and I'll make this quick. But the background on that picture is, the Saturday Evening Post in 1950 is a slice of Americana. That's Norman Rockwell writ large. An artist, not Norman Rockwell, but that was the style. You do something kind of like Norman Rockwell. There was an artist who did a drawing for that, pretty much the same scene, same characters, whatnot. He put black people in it, and he put his family. He put his family in there, and he put his black maid in the picture, and a couple of other people. The editorial board of the Saturday Evening Post would not accept his cover. They said, you can do the cover, but you can't put it in with black people.
There you go.
That makes us uneasy. So he refused to put his picture forward. So they got a replacement artist to take the same thing and white it over. That's where we were in the 1950s.
Well, my question was about Otto, but you answered it.
Oh, okay.
Well, listen, good luck. I mean, obviously this is a work in progress, and you're not giving up too quick. So congratulations to you.
Well, my plan is to go to New York and meet up with some of you, and I'm going to get to that roof. I want to get to the roof.
I put a note out before. I taught for 35 years, less than a mile from where the shot was supposedly done. And the High Bridge Pool, I mentioned that too, was in the movie In the Heights. I know that area very well. Unfortunately, I'm in Arizona now, but Gary will meet you there. Gary's going to go up on the roof with you.
And Dan, by the way, there's a gentleman on board, Peter Laskovich.
Okay.
Peter gives tours right over there. I don't know, Peter, did we actually see the apartment building where
Yes,
it took place?
we did. I remember it.
We did, okay.
Yep.
All right, Paul, you're up.
Thank you, Dan, very much. One is a comment and two, and then another, just a question, but I actually lived in Orange County in Monroe, and I know that building in Warwick. Apparently that building was let go for quite a while, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Jehovah's Witnesses took over the property and built their world headquarters there, if I'm not mistaken. And then the other thing I just wanted to ask you, when you said the police talked to him and said they were going to let his aunt out of jail, what was she in jail for at the time?
I'm sorry, I might have, there were a lot of things here and I tried to keep the chains moving, so I might have missed a thing here or there. So she was arrested also, and she was arrested at the same time Peebles was, and she was arrested for harboring concealed weapons.
Right, okay.
So she was held on $2,500 bail. So she was in jail for a time. I don't know how long. I mean, at some point after Peebles' confession, she was let out of jail, and she was out of jail by sometime like mid-July, like maybe the following week, sometime, give or take. But she was held there for a time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Sure.
Hey, Paul, is the drive-in theater still in Warwick open, or?
I think it is, believe it or not.
About
There aren't
that?
many drive-ins. There's one in Hyde Park that's open, and I think the one in Warwick is still open.
There you go. Bill
been there in
Twake,
a
you're
while.
up.
Hey,
Okay.
thank you very much, Dan. I did read the article, and obviously the book is a great one. Everyone should read it cover to cover. I wish I could tell you I did, but I did read your article. A few others too.
Good enough. Good enough.
Thanks. You present a scenario, and it's one that I think all of us would like to believe. Maybe you could tell us more of the thinking behind it, that there was a second character there on the roof. And for whatever reason, that Peebles was afraid to speak out. It would seem to me that under the kind of pressure that he got as a black man from white detectives and whoever, that, excuse the term, he would have rolled on somebody. I don't know. I can't imagine. Help me walk through this, how this scenario can play out, that he just simply, I'm going to cover for this other guy. I'm taking the fall and I'm going to Warwick or wherever he ended up. Who would have that kind of power over him to keep his mouth shut? I want to believe something here.
Right. So I think that's a good question. There's kind of like, I take this, what happened is like a prism. You can approach it from a lot of different angles. I mean, you could probably get a police officer here who's like, we always get our guy, and he could probably run through and like knock down everything I said. And then you could get somebody who's like an ACLU attorney who could rip probably even more holes through it than I did. So it's kind of two ways looking at it. So if he's there with his friend, like let's say he's there with his friend Arnold Henderson, or he's there with some other friend. I don't really know the answer to that. I think the point, because I have wondered that if I don't know why he would take the fall for Arnold Henderson. I'm just using that guy as a name. I don't know why he would do that. Conversely, I don't know why Arnold Henderson would roll on his friend. I mean, these were good friends. So I don't know what they had on Arnold Henderson. If he was up there with an adult, that could be a different thing, because if let's say there's some relative I'm not aware of, or these people that supplied him with the 22, who I don't know who they are, but let's say they're tight with him. Maybe they're really bad people. And maybe there's just sort of maybe there's leverage there. I don't know. I also gave some thought to, and I don't know if this could have happened, but I mean, we're talking speculation. Mm-hmm. Maybe Marie Beld was up there with him. Maybe there were a couple of people, maybe a few more people on there. Now I could see him not wanting to roll on his aunt, not that his aunt fired it, but there's just a lot of different things to look at. like I said, definitely possible. He could have done it. And whoever did it, it's a 1 in a million shot. No one's over there like, I got to kill Bernard Doyle. I can see him from the top of the roof. That's not happening. Could have happened, but I just don't feel like it happened the way it's presented. Like, I don't know why how he wouldn't know that that's where the Polo Grounds is, how he wouldn't know that that something bad had happened. There's just like so many holes. It's just
the other thing in celebration, and you know, I kind of get a feel for this. People in Phoenix around Christmas and 4th of July in neighborhoods shoot guns off, but you know what they do? They shoot them up in the air. Typically, you know, the shots are, you know, like this. They're not like this. They're
right.
And so if he did this up in the air thing, it's not going anywhere. You know, it's going to go a block or so, maybe, but it's not going to the Polo Grounds.
I kind of wondered too if, and I have this in the article. There's a number of things in the article in the book, hint, hint, that I haven't covered here today. But you know, I kind of wondered, like, who is he up there with, and maybe anything you can imagine. When something that bad happens, anything could be possible. Like you said, you would normally shoot up, or you've got 3 other angles to shoot at where you know the park isn't. Why not shoot like that way, where it's just going to come down on a roof or something? But you know, we're talking a 14-year-old. If he's up there with other 14-year-olds, they're 14 years old. They could be goofing around, they could be horsing around. Maybe they didn't even intend to shoot something, but they got wrestling and playing around. Next thing you know, poof. I mean, could have been drugs involved. Maybe they were high. I mean, you can imagine any number of scenarios. I don't know if he did do it. I don't know why it would have taken him 3 days to try to get that out of him. But then again, these things don't happen. Only on TV do they happen in about a half an hour, and then you fade to black and go to commercial. So did you have another question, or you had some other?
No, I didn't, but I do have to apologize, guys. I don't think you'll miss me, but I have to go to another Zoom session, and this one is part of employment. So you know, this is the fun part of life. I gotta go do my job right now.
Thanks, Bill.
See you. Thank you.
Dan, there's a question.
Hey, Dan.
Chat
Good to
room
see you.
from Stephen Banuelos. Could the shot have been fired anywhere from another section in the stadium?
I don't think so. I really don't. They pretty much, I kind of look at, like, if you're trying to comb an area to find bullets or a weapon or anything, to me, the Polo Grounds is kind of like a finite space. It's concrete, it's organized, it's a grid. You just look, you have a number of people, it's an enclosed area, and unless somebody just somehow shoots somebody and then they take everything with them. But if there's any trace, you would find it. Whereas the area outside the park is much more problematic. I mean, Coogan's Bluff has trees, bushes, shrubs. It's got elevation differences. And then when you start going out into the neighborhood, which the police did, they set a grid for like a 30-block area. It's, God, it's like trying to find something in the Amazon, you know? So I think it's much more likely it came from outside the stadium. I have wondered if it didn't come from 515 Edgecombe Avenue, could it have come from some other area in Coogan's Bluff? And whoever did that, maybe they just never found them or whatnot. Possible. Don't really know.
Thanks. We're gonna go to Dan Taylor and then Harvey Weinberg, and then
Well,
Dennis.
first off, Dan, great to see you again, and congratulations.
Good to see you, Dan.
Really nice job. You mentioned the Afro-American picking up on this, and their reporter being kind of an investigative guy on it. Any of the other black papers, the New York Age, the Pittsburgh Courier, which had bureaus, the Chicago Defender, any of them jump on this by any chance?
Not that I could find. There were papers that ran with James Hicks's coverage. He was the one who did the lion's share of the work. There was another black paper called the Carolina Times, and they had a little bit of information there about Peebles' hearing. That's where, like, when the court hearing that he had, as far as newspapers go, that's where I got some at least some kernel of facts from the hearing. But other than that, you know, the white press didn't even really cover the hearing that thoroughly. I mean, they really dug hard into the shooting the few days after that. But then after that, the hearing itself, I mean, basically like, well, here's what happened. paragraph at the most. Here's the judge who sentenced him or whatnot. But other than that, really not too much. Since you mentioned the black angle here, I did come across one very odd tidbit through this, and Peebles had a what I would call like a bureaucratic, not his main court hearing, but prior to that, like more of an administrative hearing in children's court. And the judge who presided over that was Judge Jane Boland, who was the first black woman judge in our country's history in New York City. Served there until roughly 2000, somewhere in the 2000s or whatnot.
All right, Harvey Weinberg, and then we'll go Dennis Snelling. Harvey?
I really didn't have any questions, but I'm still trying to figure out how the bullet entered the dead guy's head, correct?
Yeah.
From behind?
No, would have come from Coogan's Bluff over the park, coming down. Doyle is sitting here, he's turning to talk to a auto flag, comes down kind of like roughly like at this angle. I'm not being precise here, but it's not coming from behind him. It's not coming from the side. It's Peebles is like this. Gun goes that way towards the park, allegedly, and comes down and hits him like that. I mean, it's really a 1 in a million shot. If he could have shot maybe 30 seconds earlier, and maybe Doyle was leaning over to tie his shoe. I mean, it's just
what I'm
wrong place,
trying to
wrong
say
time.
is that there are people. He's not sitting in the back row or the front row. He's sitting in the middle of a section, correct?
Yes, he's 3 and 4, so kind of reasonably near an aisle, but not right on the aisle.
I don't know that much. I mean, I once fired a 45 in the military, and it's got a pretty good range, but I don't think you could throw a curveball from a gun.
Well, it wouldn't really have had to.
Straight.
It could go straight. I mean, the only thing so when Peebles is firing here, let me, I don't know if I still have, actually I won't, because I don't still have this screen share, but if you take the picture where they were up on top of the roof looking at the polo grounds, you can see there, now it is possible for a shot. I'm not talking about the distance or the angle, but I'm just talking about, could someone, if someone really wanted to shoot at that area and went to that building, top of the roof, and wanted to at least make the attempt, you have a direct angle to do so. It will go from the building over the home plate edge of the polo grounds. It would come over that. It would land on somebody in section 42 because there's no overhang to block it. The only way it could fail is like if there was some overhang to block it. Like if you were trying to hit somebody in another part of the ballpark and there's an overhang, you can't do it. But there was an angle there to do it.
Did you check any records from the district attorney's office? Now, they make an arrest of a juvenile, which was not prosecuted by the time I got to the DA's office 23 years later. It was the Corporation Counsel's office that prosecuted juveniles, unless it was I don't want to call it a capital case, but in 1950, that could have been a capital case because I believe they had the death penalty. Did you check any of the records of the DA's office? I don't know if they still have them from 1950.
I did not. And when I say I didn't, I don't mean that in a lazy way. I did do a little bit of digging into some court records and whatnot. And that would require, I'm stymied because I think a lot of this stuff would take a Freedom of Information Act request or the files are archived. And then it would take a lot of time and digging. And it's not a matter of like, well, I'll just call them up.
I don't even know if they still exist from 1950.
I don't know. I mean, I just worked on an article where I was trying to access court records in the San Francisco municipal court system. And I went down, I actually live here. So I went down there and that was brutal. I mean, that was absolutely brutal. And I couldn't find the records. No one could find them. So I don't know about 1950, but I'd actually be happy if you get my email from Gary, or if you want to email or contact me, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that and pick your brain on that.
Sure, Gary, will help
Absolutely.
us out with that.
Absolutely. Thanks,
Thanks.
Harvey. We'll go to Dennis and then Ed. Dennis, you're up.
Hi, Dan. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
I think most of my questions were just asked.
Okay.
I was curious about whether you had access to an autopsy report or anything that would indicate whether like the bullet went in clean or was tumbling, or it sounds like there was no opportunity for it to ricochet off anything. So mostly, I was wondering where in the head the wound was. So you kind of answered all that.
Yeah. I mean, the records could be out there, but you know, they would be archived and buried. I mean, from having worked on Northern Ireland criminal and human rights issues, I know that people on both sides who went through the system in the 70s, you can still access their information, but it's not, you don't call the Northern Ireland Police Department and say, hey, I'd really like to take a look at this. Like, well, we'll get right on that. So I don't know. I don't know. Also, with some of the research, not just police records, but genealogical, census data, medical health records, you run into sort of like this time frame where, okay, 100 years from now, sure, you can access everything you want. 50 years from now, you can access this. 20 years, you can access this. A lot of stuff, it's hard to get a hold of. That's why I said, well, in 3 years from now, there will be some records I can access, but they will not be publicly released until that, where I could actually learn a lot about people's upbringing. But you can only go with what you can go with at the time. It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating.
Thanks, Dennis. Good to see you. Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really neat picture, though, the polo grounds from the top of the apartment building.
It is.
You said this was the 4th of July. Did you mention earlier what was the temperature that day?
Yes, that was one thing I had written down, but I just skipped through it because, again, trying to move the chains. It was basically like a nice summer day, 70s, 80s, humidity, the same thing. And the way I think the New York Daily News described it, there was just enough breeze to chase the flies away. That was the temperature.
Because, I mean, it looked like the top of that building is tarmac. And this fellow's going to Coney Island 3 hours later. Seemed like that's not the ideal place to be at that time, 12:30.
I don't know. Actually, when I wrote the article, I didn't know that Peebles went to Coney Island at 3 o'clock. That's something in the last few months I've done some more digging, and I came across a couple of newspaper articles that I wasn't aware of. And one of them actually did mention that he had gone to Coney Island. He was gone from 3, came back at 9. And that's around the time that the police found him and questioned him.
But there were witnesses that placed him on that roof in that heat.
Going by, again, this is based on a news article, and this would have come from the police because the press wouldn't have really had any ability to, they were kind of going what the police fed them. So I would imagine that came from the police. It wasn't from an investigative reporter, like, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't choose to go up on the top of that building during that heat, maybe at the night, but just seems a little fishy. I'll let it go at that.
Well, then again, I grew up in upstate New York. I know what a hot summer day is like. And when it wasn't like brutal there. I mean, it was not like it was like up in the 90s or something, but there's some days without the air conditioning, you're like, is it better to be inside? Is it better to be outside? You go back and forth. And when you're 14 years old, your attitude about this is a whole lot different than when you're 74, you know.
It was tarmac though.
Yeah.
Not the evening. If it had to be hot.
I would think so. I would think so.
Okay.
And I have a question, and then we're going to go to Carmine. Did the police try to reenact the crime as far as the Giants are off one day, bring a gun up to the top of the roof and fire it into the polo grounds when no people are?
I don't know. It would be a good investigative procedure to do so. And I would hope that they would do that. I don't know. I never read anything.
Harvey was mentioning about, can a shot from the roof reach that point? So I don't understand why the police wouldn't at least fire a gun with nobody in the stands.
Gary, I I don't think that the police would have fired a live round in at any point in Manhattan intentionally.
Even if
Like
nobody's
that.
in the stands?
Doesn't matter.
They wouldn't. I don't think they would do that.
Okay, you know better
Yeah.
than me, so.
No, I don't think they would do that.
Yeah, I would think that they would.
No
they
way.
would go
Even
up
in
and-
1950, which
Yeah.
was, I can understand when you talk about the kid confessing, and it took 3 days.
Yeah.
That's 16 years before the Miranda case. You know, you got the right to remain silent.
Yeah.
So they're taking and the right to a counsel. So they're leaning on the kid, and using all their persuasive powers and so on. And he comes up with a confession 3 days after the event.
That's a good point. And I think that I agree. I think that makes sense. I actually never really thought about that too much, but I think it makes sense that they probably wouldn't fire a live round, even with the stadium empty. But I guess I would be disappointed to learn that they didn't go to the top of the roof to at least see what the angle was or whatnot. I know that the only journalist who went up there, at least by their own writing or admission, was James Hicks. There were some good articles about the case, but I never got the sense from any of the articles, whether there's the Daily News or the New York Times or whatnot, I never got a sense of like, well, I'm a journalist. I got a lot of information from various people, but then I did this. James Hicks was the only one I got the sense would be like a more of a modern standard, like, well, I'm taking all the information you've given me, but I'm also going to be, I'm going to go to the roof, or if I can't go to the roof, at least I'll go to the front of 515 Edgecombe and sniff around. There just really wasn't much of an investigation from a journalism standpoint. It was pretty bad, at least from the white press.
Thanks, Dan. Carmen?
Yes, to join in the speculation a little bit. Somebody asked the question of the timeline. When did the young man know that his bullet actually killed somebody? He confessed 3 days later, but when was he aware?
Right.
And when did he throw the gun away?
From the press accounts, which are from the police, the shot happened at 12:30. About a half an hour later, he learned from a woman in the neighborhood when he was out on the street that the shot had gone off and it had killed someone. By that time, there would have been at least some radio coverage of it, not so much with a whole lot of information of like what happened, but there would have been something like a fan was killed at the ballpark. You know, people would have had radios and, you know, be listening to the game and whatnot. So it was about, I guess it was like about a half an hour after the shot went off, give or take.
And according to his confession, he threw the gun away shortly thereafter.
Took the gun. Well, when he learned that that shot had happened, he got nervous, grabbed the gun, took it down to the. I'm sorry. When he was done, he went back down to the basement, got the gun from the basement, then took it to Highbridge Park and ditched it.
Yeah, I'm just joining the speculation that everybody else says. 14-year-old kids do stupid things, whether they're black, white, or Chinese.
Definitely.
And the most plausible thing to me is growing up the way he grew up, because I work with youth, was my lifetime's work, to protect the aunt, who was somebody who took care of him. I think that would be most speculation that I'd be leaning to, where the cops put the squeeze on him. And you said the aunt was released shortly thereafter at some point.
Yeah, there was a social worker who visited. So I have a note from the clinic that he went to. I have access to some of their records, and one of the social workers who worked there took some notes of. She went to the hearing, and then she also visited Beld, and Beld said that that they basically kind of put the arm on Peebles, like, hey, if you confess, we'll let your old aunt, they referred to her as like the old aunt, out. And I can see that being a plausible scenario where you would do something like that to try to help that along. I don't know. One person I talked with was Doyle's granddaughter, one of his granddaughters, and she summed it up perfectly. She said, if there's one thing we can learn from this, it's like guns and kids don't mix.
Absolutely. All right,
Yep.
thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Enjoyed it.
Sure. Thank you.
Anybody else who hasn't spoken yet have a question that they want to answer before we say goodnight? Steve, go ahead.
Oh, good night.
Oh.
Good night.
I'd like
All
to,
right,
before I go, I'd actually like to shout out someone else who helped me a lot with this article, as he does most things I write, and that is fellow Great Daner Ken Mannion down there. We've been reading each other's stuff since Gary, since you were in school. That's how long ago it was. But he was a tremendous help. He read this whole long damn article, and he can find logical inconsistencies and proofreading mistakes and everything and good ideas. So got to give a shout out to him.
Dan, we can't thank.
I just want to say thank you, Dan. Just real quickly, thanks for letting me hang out with you guys. It was a lot of fun. So I appreciate it. And Dan, I'm going to want to talk with you because there are a couple of things that we talked about. I got to say to all of you, that article Dan wrote originally was a fantastic, well-researched article, but he's done a crap ton of research since then, which is all new to me. And it's great to hear it. And it's great that he's keeping up with it. I think Dan's going to crack the case before long. So tip of the cap to Dan, and thanks again to all of you guys.
Dan, tomorrow or the next day when I send out the recording of this, we'll put on the link to Stu's great book that, you know, if anybody besides your stuff, there's an amazing amount of information in there that's Stu.
I'd like to encourage anyone on this call too, since a lot of you live there, if you have any free time, if you'd like to go to the High Bridge Park area and just rummage through the bushes and the shrubs and anything, if you find anything, would you please let me know?
All right, let's
Peter,
all
we
give it
could
up.
do that on a follow-up scavenger hunt.
Ed,
Can
do
I
you
ask one
you
more?
yeah, go ahead, Ed. Hurry up.
What was the result of the doubleheader anyway?
Oh, I think that's the one question I can't answer. I don't, you can look it up.
I guess so.
And
Retro
I know that
sheet
there
would
was a
have that.
fight. There was a fight on the field between Leo DeRocher and Carl Ferrolo, which is not a
All
really
right.
hard thing to imagine. That I remember.
Retro
Well,
sheet would have everything on that, but good question, Ed.
okay.
All right, Dan, let's all give it up for Dan. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan, very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Next
So
week,
much
we'll,
things.
next week we'll have Joe Conte with the book about the rivalry between the Dodgers and the Giants. Have a great night. If you want to hang for a few minutes to just chat about other things, door is open.
That was outstanding.
Great job.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stu.
Yeah, I mean, it's just because you keep coming up, you keep coming up with the stuff now, the Coney Island, because that's, so I hope you're able to continue writing, and if there's a book in it too. And, with all of the stuff that many of us try to track down in baseball, there's just fun quests that we don't know. And this is a good one.
Well, when it first started, Stu said, well, go ahead. Why don't you, I knew that Stu was writing the book. And I said, well, hey, it was actually Ken who sent me the picture of Bernard Doyle. I'd never even heard of this case. And so I sent it to Stu, and I knew he was doing a book on the Polo Grounds. So I said, well, Stu, are you aware of this? You should put this in your book. So Stu said, well, if you got time, why don't you write something about it? It doesn't have to be long. It could be like about 1,500 words, just something I can plug in the book. And I thought, well, 1,500 words, I can do that in my sleep. And then months later, years later, because it took a while for the book to come out, it just became sort of an obsession. It's definitely, as you can see from the discussion we had here today, it's a real rabbit hole. There's a lot of things that could add up, but then they don't add up. Gary, you said it's like JFK. It is a little bit like that.
We've got to make sure the Saber Landmarks Committee started just over a week ago, and I'm covering Minnesota. And in fact, I just sent to the guy, I think his name is Mike Bender, who's got New York, to tell him to be sure and include the Norma Jean suite at the Hotel Lexington, where DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe. But I think I'll get in touch with them and say see what they can do for landmarks for this 515 Edgecombe. Not that there's a plaque there or anything like that, but this is that thing is designed for the people who like to go out and see different things. A guy who had the book Babe Ruth slept here, and and I knew where Lou Gehrig lived. When I'm in New York, go see that. If I'm there again, I think I've got to go take a look and take a picture of 515 Edgecombe.
I agree.
Speaking of landmarks and stuff like that, I forgot to mention earlier, about a week and a half ago, I received an email from the CEO of the Staten Island Ferry Hawks. I had written him a letter regarding a ticket promotion they are having, or it's called a Shot Heard Around the World ticket promotion, 23 games. So I wrote to this man, Eric Shuffler, really nice guy, and I suggested that since the Yankees are no longer associated with Staten Island, that they would think about erecting a Bobby Thompson statue. He's probably the most famous Staten Islander there was in regards to sports. He's known as the Staten Island Scott, and he wrote back a really nice letter. The team is just beginning this year. It's an independent team. So to have a statue of Thompson would not be hurting the Yankees, since the Yankees are no longer no longer part of that organization. He's going to get back to me, and hopefully we're going to have a nice chat. And I told him that our group would, of course, be 1,000% behind that. So
Now that you're in Sabre,
hey,
and I'm
Stu, do me a favor. Can
Yeah.
you just tilt your TV? We only see your forehead. There you go.
well, if I
There
do
you
this,
go.
you can see the Polo Grounds. That's much better. I'm happy that you're in Sabre now, and I'll work with you to make sure you get to be a part of this landmarks committee, because in addition to documenting landmarks, we've got 3 plaques here in the Twin Cities I want to see go up, and they're going to be looking into that to get markers erected. And
It's still when
statue.
if you and Dan come into town, like I said, Peter Laskowicz, we went on a tour this summer of all the places around the Polo Grounds, and he'll get you there. It's right at the top of the stairs.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Across the street. But maybe you'll get a picture of whatever it is you need.
Yeah. Well, it's we're gonna get you involved now that you're in Sabre, Gary. We'll get you involved in some of this landmark stuff too.
Yeah, I think next Wednesday I have some kind of orientation to show me how to navigate the site. So
Well, ask him how to get signed up on the landmarks committee.
and
or
let
else
me
I
ask, I asked this of Dan. Since I signed up, I've been getting, like, I forgot what it's called, some kind of trivia question every day.
Oh,
Horsehide or something?
Horsehide trivia. Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
It says it's associated with them, so.
Yeah, it's probably a member.
Okay,
That sounds familiar, but I can't think of who's behind it.
got it. Anybody else? Any comments, questions?
Since we were talking about 515 Edgecombe, and like it's kind of like a whodunit. Apart from going there and seeing the building itself and going to the roof, which would be interesting, I've always thought one of the ways to crack the case is if I'd be willing to do it. Maybe I don't come out alive. I don't know, but start walking around to Harlem, go to barbershops, go to historical societies, go to beauty salons, start talking, because somebody, even if they don't know for a fact, there's definitely probably an urban legend. Like my girlfriend who was on the call tonight, her brother dated somebody in the 70s. So when I started writing this, she said, well, his old girlfriend, she knew about that. She even mentioned it to my brother. She said, I think what happened, that was just bullshit. And I'm thinking, like, that's like one little person.
Yeah.
It's probably like an alternative history.
The top of the building is fascinating. It reminded me of like Tourette's, I forgot what it's called, but where you can shoot the guns or the cannons. In the older days, the roof was beautiful looking.
Dan, what's coming out in 2025? Census or something where you can get some more information on?
There's some census information coming out this year. It wouldn't be really huge, but there's an embargo period where you can't get the census from 10 years ago. So we were able to get the census from 1940. That's how I was always able to trace where Marie Bell was living in the 40s and 30s and 20s. The 1950 census should be coming out. I think it gets unembargoed, I think this month or maybe next month. I'm gonna have to look. And if I can find her there, at least I could probably determine, assuming she was there when they took the census, well, I know she was living there. I know Robert was there, but maybe there would be some indication of how many people they were living with. Maybe there was someone else there. I don't think there's going to be a smoking gun there, but it would be something a little bit more pieced together than, well, was he just living with his great aunt or was he living with several lodgers? Don't really know. And the other part in 2025, those are congressional records.
Oh, okay.
And they're embargoed until 2025. And that I know because I did the letter writing bureaucracy part of it. And actually the people there were very helpful. I wasn't getting the like, go away and die. They were very helpful and just like, nope, you can't access these. They had like a little portion that was public. You could look at that. But you can't look at the rest of it until 2025. So there it is. I just have to live another 3 years and we'll be good to go. And Stu, we'll do another book.
That's what James Garrison said in